Sometimes, the most dangerous decisions are made in silence. The restaurant was full that night, the kind of quiet luxury where conversation stayed low and every movement felt deliberate. Silverware clinking softly against porcelain, heels tapping lightly across polished floors. And in the middle of it all, Emily Carter moved like she always did, unnoticed, precise, calm, her tray balanced effortlessly in one hand while her eyes caught everything people thought no one saw. The subtle tension in a customer's jaw, the way a hand lingered too long on a phone screen, the pause before someone answered a question they weren't ready for. She had learned long ago that silence spoke louder than words, especially in places like this, where power sat at every table but rarely announced itself. And that was why she noticed him before anyone else did. Daniel Hayes, seated at table 12, his presence quiet but undeniable. The kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice because the room adjusted around him. His suit sharp, his watch understated but unmistakably expensive. His attention fixed on his phone as if the world outside it didn't exist. She had served men like him before, or at least men who tried to be him. But there was something different tonight, something off, not in what he did, but in what he didn't do, because when his phone rang, he didn't answer right away. He stared at it for a second too long, then stood, stepping away from the table, his chair sliding back just enough to make a soft sound against the floor, subtle, but enough for her to glance up. He walked a few steps toward the edge of the dining room, turning slightly away, but not far enough, not completely, and when he answered, his voice was low, controlled, the kind of tone that carried only what it wanted to carry, but not everything, not quite. Emily wasn't trying to listen. She never tried. That wasn't how she worked. She just heard things, pieces, fragments. The way someone might notice a draft in a closed room. And this time, it was a sentence that didn't belong. He doesn't know. The board signs tonight. The words slipped into the air and settled somewhere they shouldn't have, and Emily's hand paused mid-motion, just for a second, just long enough for her breath to shift, because she understood enough to know that wasn't normal, not for a conversation like that, not in a place like this. She kept moving, because that's what she did. She always kept moving. But something had changed, something quiet and heavy, like the moment before a storm when the air turned still. She placed a glass of water on another table, nodded politely to a guest who barely looked at her, but her mind stayed on that sentence, repeating it, turning it over, not fully understanding yet, but knowing it mattered, knowing it wasn't meant for her ears, and yet, it was there now. And once something like that found its way in, it didn't leave easily. Daniel ended the call quickly, too quickly, his posture tightening for just a fraction of a second before he composed himself again, before he returned to the table like nothing had happened, like everything was still under control. But Emily noticed the difference, the slight shift in his expression, the way his fingers lingered near his phone before pulling back, the way he didn't sit immediately, just stood there for a moment, thinking, calculating, and then sitting down as if the decision had already been made. Whatever it was, whatever that call meant, it was already in motion, and Emily, standing just a few feet away, realized something simple and terrifying at the same time. No one else had heard it. No one else was paying attention. The room continued exactly as before. Glasses refilled, plates delivered, quiet laughter filling the air. But beneath it all, something was wrong. Something quiet. Something dangerous. And she was the only one who knew it. The only one who had heard the sentence that shouldn't exist. The only one standing between knowing and doing nothing. And for the first time that night, Emily Carter didn't feel invisible anymore. Emily kept moving, because stopping would mean thinking, and thinking would make it real. Her steps measured, her expression unchanged as she carried plates from the kitchen to the dining floor. But her mind replayed the sentence again and again, each time slower, each time heavier. He does not know. The board signs tonight. It was not just what was said, it was how it was said, quiet, controlled, like something already decided, like a door already closing somewhere far beyond this room. She set a plate down at table 9, smiled politely, stepped back, but her eyes drifted toward table 12 again. Daniel Hayes had not touched his drink. Condensation gathered on the glass, untouched, forgotten. His attention fixed somewhere else, not on his meal, not on the people around him, but inward, calculating, adjusting. She had seen that look before, not in men like him, but in people who realized too late that something had slipped out of their control. The difference was, men like him were not supposed to lose control, not even for a second. And yet, something in that call suggested exactly that. Emily turned toward the service station, her fingers brushing against the stack of receipts, the small, ordinary slips of paper that passed through her hands. Hundreds of times a night. Nothing important, nothing permanent, just numbers, totals, signatures, things people glanced at and forgot. But tonight, one of those pieces of paper felt heavier than it should. She pulled a blank receipt slowly, her pen hovering above it. Not writing yet, just waiting, because she did not have the full picture, not yet. Only fragments, and fragments could be dangerous if they were wrong. She exhaled softly, steadying herself, then glanced again toward Daniel. He was scrolling through something on his phone now, faster than before, his jaw tightening slightly, a subtle shift, but enough for her to understand that whatever that call had been, it had not ended with the call. It was continuing, unfolding, and time, whatever time meant in this situation, was moving forward whether she acted or not. She thought about ignoring it, about letting it pass, because that was the safest choice. The expected choice. She was a waitress, not an analyst, not part of whatever world he belonged to. Her job was to serve, to remain invisible, to leave decisions to people like him. But the sentence would not leave her mind. It stayed there, repeating, like a quiet warning. She could not silence. She lowered her pen and began to write. Not words, not explanations, just numbers, a sequence she had seen once before, months ago, when a regular customer had complained about a delayed transaction, something about internal codes, something about how companies tracked movements no one else could see. She did not fully understand it then, and she did not fully understand it now, but she remembered enough to recognize patterns, enough to connect the way those numbers had been structured to the fragments she had overheard. It was a risk, she knew that, a risk of being wrong, of overstepping, of drawing attention to herself in a way she had spent years avoiding. But doing nothing felt worse, because doing nothing meant accepting that something was happening right in front of her and choosing not to see it. She finished writing, her handwriting small, precise, the numbers blending into the rest of the receipt like they belonged there, like they were just another detail no one would question. She placed it carefully with the check presenter, her hands steady now, calmer than before, as if the decision itself had settled something inside her. Then she walked back toward table 12, each step deliberate, controlled. She set the check down in front of Daniel without a word, without hesitation, just another routine action in a night full of routine actions. But as she stepped away, she allowed herself one brief glance, just one. He looked down at the receipt, casually at first, the way anyone would, his eyes scanning the total, the items, the expected details, and then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he stopped. His fingers froze against the edge of the paper, and for the first time since he had entered the restaurant, Daniel Hayes did not look composed. He looked still, completely still, as if something had just shifted beneath him, something he had not expected, something he could not ignore. And Emily, already turning away, already disappearing back into the rhythm of the room, knew without looking again that the silence had changed. Daniel did not move for a full second. Then, too, his eyes fixed on the receipt as if the numbers might rearrange themselves if he waited long enough. But they did not. They stayed exactly where they were, quiet, precise, impossible to ignore. His fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the paper, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him to feel it, that subtle shift from control to awareness. He reached for his phone immediately, not with panic, but with purpose, the kind of movement that came from years of making decisions under pressure. His screen lit up, reflections of data and numbers flickering across his eyes as he opened something only he could access, something deeper than emails or messages, something internal. And as he entered the sequence from the receipt, one number at a time, his expression changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention, but in a way that removed something, the confidence, the certainty, the quiet assumption that everything was exactly as it should be. Emily watched without watching, moving past his table with another tray, her posture unchanged, her steps even, but her awareness locked onto him. because she did not need to see his screen to know that the numbers had landed exactly where they needed to. His thumb paused mid-air, hovering just above the glass, as if he had reached a point he could not immediately process. Then he exhaled, slow, controlled, and stood up again, this time without hesitation. His chair sliding back with a sharper sound than before, not loud enough to disrupt the room, but enough to break the rhythm of his own composure. He walked quickly toward the exit, already dialing, already speaking before the line fully connected, his voice lower now, tighter, the kind of tone that carried urgency without raising volume. Stop everything. Do not sign anything. I need 10 minutes. He paused, listening, his jaw tightening as whatever he heard confirmed what the numbers had already told him. No, do not move forward. I said stop. He ended the call without waiting for a response, his reflection briefly catching in the glass doors before he pushed them open and disappeared into the night. Outside, the air was cooler, sharper, and for the first time that evening, Daniel Hayes moved like a man who was not ahead of the situation, but chasing it. His car was already waiting at the curb, the driver stepping forward. But Daniel did not slow down. He opened the door himself, sliding into the back seat while his phone was already back in his hand, fingers moving faster now, pulling up files, cross-checking, confirming what he had just uncovered. The sequence on that receipt was not random. It was not a guess. It was a direct reference to a transaction buried inside his company's internal system, a transaction that should not exist, not tonight, not without his authorization. And yet it was there, scheduled, waiting, aligned perfectly with the timeline from that call. The board signs tonight. The words echoed now with clarity he could not ignore. This was not a simple transfer, not a minor discrepancy. This was something larger, something structured, something designed to move without being seen until it was too late. He tapped another command, pulling up the full chain. And that was when it shifted completely, the realization hitting not as a shock, but as a cold certainty. This was not just money moving. This was control changing hands, a silent agreement, a decision made without him, his company, his authority, everything tied to a signature that had not yet happened. 10 minutes. That was all he had said. 10 minutes before something irreversible locked into place. The car pulled into traffic, merging into the flow of the city, lights passing in. Quick streaks against the windows, but inside, everything narrowed to a single point, a single deadline. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice steady again, but now carrying something sharper, something focused. Drive faster. And back inside the restaurant, where nothing seemed to have changed, where glasses still clinked and conversations still flowed, Emily Carter placed another order on a table and moved on, her expression calm, her presence quiet, as if she had not just shifted the direction of something far beyond that room, as if she had not just turned silence into action, and as if she would never ask to be seen for it. The city moved fast, but not fast enough for 10 minutes to feel like anything but a countdown. Every traffic light stretching longer than it should, every passing block measured against a clock Daniel could not see but felt in every second. His phone remained in his hand, screen glowing with layers of data most people would never understand. But to him it was clear now, painfully clear. The sequence from the receipt had unlocked a path hidden beneath routine operations, a transaction scheduled to execute alongside a board approval, disguised as a restructuring agreement, but in reality something far more permanent, a transfer of controlling shares that would shift decision-making power away from him without a single visible confrontation. No alarms, no conflict, just signatures and silence. He tapped into another layer, pulling up authorization logs, and there it was, the approval chain already in motion, names he trusted, signatures he recognized, all aligned in a way that should have reassured him, but instead did the opposite. Because he knew those names would not align like that without coordination, without intention. Someone had orchestrated this carefully, quietly, and almost perfectly. Almost, because one small detail had slipped through, one sequence of numbers written on a receipt in a restaurant that no one in his world would ever consider important, and that single detail had reached him just in time. The car turned sharply onto a familiar avenue, the glass tower ahead rising into view, his company's headquarters, its lights still on, floors glowing like a grid of silent decisions being made behind closed doors. Inside, The board was already gathering, already preparing to finalize what they believed was just another step forward. Unaware that the foundation beneath that decision had been compromised, Daniel leaned forward, his voice calm again, but carrying something colder now, more precise. Call legal. Tell them to freeze any pending resolutions. No approvals go through until I am in that room. He did not wait for confirmation. He did not need it. His focus had narrowed completely, everything reduced to a single objective. Reach that room before the final signature, before silence became permanence. The car pulled to a stop, and he stepped out immediately, the night air barely registering as he moved toward the entrance. His pace quick but controlled, each step deliberate, the security doors opening as he approached, familiar faces nodding in recognition. But he did not return the gesture, not tonight. Tonight was not about routine, not about presence. It was about interruption, about stopping something that had been designed to move without interruption. The elevator ride felt longer than it was, numbers climbing one by one. Each floor another second gone, another moment closer to a decision being locked in. When the doors opened, the hallway was already active, quiet conversations, measured steps, the controlled energy of executives preparing to finalize something important. But Daniel did not slow down. He walked straight toward the conference room. The door partially closed, voices inside, steady, professional. Unaware, he pushed the door open without hesitation, and the room fell silent. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, as attention shifted toward him, as recognition spread across faces that did not expect to see him there. Not yet, not at this stage. A document lay on the table, pens placed carefully beside it, ready, waiting, the final step in a process that had been building for weeks, maybe months. Daniel stepped forward, his gaze moving across the room, taking in each face, each expression, not accusing, not reacting, just observing, and then he spoke, his voice even, controlled, carrying across the table without force. We are not signing anything tonight. The words landed softly, but their effect was immediate. A pause, a shift, confusion flickering in the eyes of some, calculation in others, and somewhere in that room, one person understood exactly what had just happened, understood that something had been seen that was never supposed to be seen. And back in the restaurant, far from glass towers and boardrooms, Emily Carter refilled a glass of water, her movement steady, her presence unchanged, as if the night had remained exactly the same, as if silence had not just been broken miles away because she chose to listen when no one else did. No one reached for the pen, not immediately. The room held its breath in that quiet, controlled way that only powerful people knew how to do, where silence was not confusion but calculation. Daniel stood at the head of the table now, not raising his voice, not explaining yet, just letting the weight of his words settle. We pause here, he added, softer this time, but more deliberate. One of the board members shifted slightly in his chair, a man in his late 50s with a calm expression that had not changed much since Daniel walked in. Daniel, we are minutes away from finalizing a strategic decision, he said evenly. Everything has been reviewed. Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it. His eyes moved across the table again, slower this time, reading reactions the way Emily read a room, not through words, but through what people tried to hide, a slight tightening of a jaw, a glance exchanged too quickly, a hand that remained too still, and then he saw it. Not panic, not fear, but a moment of miscalculation in one face, subtle, almost invisible, but enough for him to understand that he was not interrupting a normal process. He was interrupting something planned, something expected to go smoothly. Then it will hold for another 10 minutes, Daniel replied, his voice steady. If it cannot hold for 10 minutes, it should not be signed at all. The words landed differently this time, not as a suggestion, but as a boundary. Another voice spoke up, sharper, less controlled. With respect, we have investors waiting on this approval. Daniel turned toward that voice, his expression calm, but his focus precise. And with respect, I have reason to believe this approval is tied to a transaction none of you have fully reviewed. The room shifted again, this time more visibly, chairs adjusting, eyes narrowing, attention sharpening. The calm structure of the meeting beginning to crack just enough to let uncertainty in. Daniel reached into his jacket and placed his phone on the table, the screen lighting up as he turned it toward them, not revealing everything, not yet, but enough to show that this was not instinct or impulse. This was information. This sequence, he said, tapping lightly on the screen, is linked to an internal transfer scheduled to execute the moment this document is signed. A pause, a beat, the kind that forced people to listen, a transfer that changes control. No one spoke immediately, because no one could, not without first processing what that meant. Control was not just ownership, it was direction, authority, everything the company stood on, and for that to shift without full awareness, without open discussion, it was not just unusual, it was unacceptable. The man who had spoken earlier leaned forward slightly now, his calm still intact, but his eyes sharper. "Where did you get that sequence?" he asked, the question simple, but loaded. Daniel did not answer right away, because the truth of that answer did not belong in this room, not in the way they expected. Instead, he said, "That is not the question that matters." And let the silence follow, heavier now, more deliberate, because the focus was no longer on him. It was on what had been uncovered, on what had almost happened without interruption. Another board member shifted, this time uneasy. "Are you suggesting someone here authorized this without disclosure?" Daniel held his gaze, steady, unblinking. "I am suggesting that something was designed to move quietly," he said. And it almost did. The room settled into a different kind of silence now, not calm, not controlled, but aware that something had been missed, that trust had been assumed where it should have been verified. And somewhere in that room, one person felt the shift more than the others, because for them, this was not confusion, it was exposure. And miles away, where the night continued without interruption, Emily Carter wiped down a table, the surface clean, the glass reflecting soft light, her movements as quiet as ever, as if she had not just placed a single detail into motion that now echoed through a room she would never enter, and as if she would never need to. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, like a room adjusting to a new truth it could not ignore. One of the board members reached for the document. Again, not to sign, but to pull it closer, scanning it as if the words might reveal something they had missed before. Daniel remained standing, not pressing, not forcing, just allowing the weight of what he had said to settle deeper, because pressure was not always applied through volume. Sometimes it came from stillness, from certainty. "Pull the transaction logs for the past 48 hours, he said finally, his voice calm, directed not at the room, but at one person near the end of the table, a woman already opening her laptop, her fingers moving quickly, the quiet tapping of keys filling the space where conversation used to be. Seconds stretched. No one spoke, because now they were waiting, not for opinions, but for proof, and proof had a way of removing everything else. The screen in front of her flickered, data loading in structured lines, timestamps, approvals, sequences of movement hidden inside routine operations. "There is something here," she said, her voice measured. "Careful." A transfer flagged as internal restructuring. Daniel nodded slightly, not surprised. "Follow it," he replied, and she did, her eyes narrowing as she traced the path, deeper, beyond the surface-level entries, into layers that required authorization most people in the room had never needed to question. Another board member leaned in, watching closely now, the room no longer divided by hierarchy, but united by the same realization: they had not been looking in the right place. "This does not align with the summary we reviewed," she continued, slower now, more deliberate. "The ownership percentages shift after execution." A pause, a longer one this time, because now the implication was clear: not just movement, not just adjustment, but control, the word no one had wanted to say out loud. Daniel did not repeat it. He did not need to. It was already understood. The man who had questioned him earlier sat back slightly, his calm finally breaking just enough to reveal something. Beneath it, not panic, but recognition that something had moved beyond assumption, beyond trust, into fact. "Who authorized this layer?" another voice asked, sharper now, directed toward the screen, toward the system, toward whoever had placed those instructions into motion. The woman hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before answering. "It is signed under executive clearance." She turned the screen slightly, enough for those closest to see. Names, signatures, approvals, all legitimate on the surface, all expected, and yet placed in a sequence that changed their meaning entirely. Daniel stepped closer, his gaze steady, scanning the list, confirming what he already knew. This had not been an accident. This had been constructed, carefully, quietly, designed to pass through unnoticed until the final step made it irreversible. This is not a restructuring, he said, his voice lower now, but more certain than before. This is a transfer of control. No one argued this time, because the data spoke where words could not. And in that moment, the room shifted completely, from discussion to decision, from assumption to action. One of the board members closed the document firmly, sliding the pen away from it, not dramatically, but with enough intention to mark the end of what had almost happened. "We halt everything," he said, not as a suggestion, but as a conclusion. Others nodded, not out of agreement with him, but with the reality now in front of them. The process was no longer valid, not until every detail had been re-examined, every assumption tested. Daniel stepped back slightly, not needing to lead the room any further, because the truth had already done that for him. And for a brief moment, just a brief one, his mind returned to the only piece of this that did not fit the system. The origin of the sequence, not from a report, not from an alert, but from something far smaller, far quieter, a handwritten detail on a receipt, placed there without recognition, without expectation, and back in the restaurant, where the night had begun. Emily Carter stood near the counter, counting change, her fingers steady, her expression calm, as if numbers were just numbers, as if they had not just carried a meaning far beyond what anyone else in that room could have imagined, and as if she would never say a word about it. The room did not return to normal after that. It could not. Something had been exposed that refused to be unseen. Conversations shifted from controlled discussions to quiet exchanges, voices lowered but sharper now, no longer debating strategy, but tracing accountability. Daniel stood slightly apart from the table, not withdrawn, but observant, letting the process unfold without forcing it further, because once truth entered a room like this, it did not need to be pushed. It moved on its own. One of the board members leaned toward another, whispering, their expressions no longer neutral, no longer certain. The structure they had relied on now questioned in real time. This sequence required dual authorization. The woman with the laptop said, her voice steady but carrying more weight now. It was not a single decision. That detail changed everything. Not just one person, not just one action, but coordination, alignment, intent. Daniel's gaze moved again, slower this time, not searching, but confirming patterns he had built his career recognizing, now visible in the smallest reactions, a hesitation before someone spoke, a glance toward the same direction more than once, a silence that lasted just a fraction too long. And then it became clear, not through confession, not through confrontation, but through absence, the absence of denial, the absence of surprise in one's seat at the table. The chief financial officer, Richard Cole, sat composed, too composed, his posture unchanged, his hands resting calmly in front of him, as if this discussion did not concern him at all, as if he were observing rather than involved. And that was the difference. Everyone else had shifted, even slightly. Except him. Daniel stepped forward just enough to bring the focus there, not aggressively, not accusing, just redirecting attention with presence alone. "Richard," he said, his tone even, almost casual, "you signed off on these projections." It was not a question, and that made it harder to deflect. Richard met his gaze without hesitation, a faint, controlled smile forming. "As part of the restructuring plan approved last quarter," he replied, smooth, measured, practiced, the kind of answer that would have held earlier. Before the room changed, before the sequence was uncovered, Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the response without accepting it, and the ownership shift embedded within that plan. He continued, still calm, still precise. "Was that disclosed in the summary we reviewed tonight?" The silence that followed was different, heavier, more focused, no longer general uncertainty, but directed attention, all eyes moving toward Richard now, waiting, not for explanation, but for alignment between his words and the data already on the screen. Richard's expression did not break, but something in his stillness changed, a fraction, almost invisible, the kind of shift only someone trained to see it would notice. The details were available in the full report, he said finally, choosing each word carefully. It was not hidden. Daniel let that sit for a moment, just long enough for others to process it, then responded. Accessible is not the same as visible. The words landed quietly, but with precision, and this time, no one interrupted, because they understood the distinction, understood that something could exist in plain sight and still be effectively concealed if no one was directed to look for it. One of the board members exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, the realization settling fully now. This would have transferred controlling interest, he said, not asking, not guessing, but stating. Richard did not respond immediately, and that silence spoke louder than anything else in the room. Daniel did not press further. He did not need to. The absence of denial had already completed the sentence. And in that moment, the outcome shifted completely, not through force, not through argument, but through clarity. A decision that had almost been finalized now unraveled in front of them, and miles away, under soft lights and quiet conversations. Emily Carter placed a final receipt into a small black folder, her hands steady, her expression unchanged, as if she had not just set in motion a chain of events that reached into a room she would never see and revealed something no one else had been listening for. No one spoke after that, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that mattered had already been understood, the kind of understanding that did not need explanation, only acknowledgement. Richard remained seated, his composure still intact on the surface, but the room no longer saw him the same way. The quiet authority he once held now replaced by a distance, a separation that no title could bridge. One of the board members closed the laptop slowly, the soft click echoing more than it should have, marking a shift not just in the meeting, but in trust itself. We will initiate a full review, he said, his voice firm, no longer cautious, no longer neutral, effective immediately. Another nodded, adding, all related accounts, all authorization chains, everything. The process had begun, not rushed, not chaotic, but deliberate, controlled, the same way the decision had almost been made, but now moving in the opposite direction. Daniel did not interrupt. He did not lead. He simply observed as the system corrected itself, because that was what strong systems did when given the truth. They adjusted, they recalibrated, they removed what did not belong. Richard finally stood, not abruptly, not defensively, just slowly, as if recognizing that the moment had passed him, that whatever had been set in motion no longer moved in his favor. He adjusted his jacket slightly, his expression still composed, but quieter now, less certain. If there are concerns, he began, his tone measured, but it did not carry the same weight as before. Not in this room. Not now. One of the board members raised a hand gently, not to silence him, but to pause him. There are facts, he said simply, and that was enough. No argument followed. No confrontation escalated, because none was needed. The data had already spoken, and in a room built on decisions, facts always carried the final word. Daniel stepped back toward the window, the city stretching out beneath him, lights steady, unchanged, as if nothing had shifted, as if everything was still. Exactly as it had been an hour ago, but it was not. Something had been prevented, something that would have unfolded quietly, without resistance, if not for a single interruption, a single detail placed. At the exact moment it was needed, he exhaled slowly, not relief, not yet, but recognition that control had not been lost, not tonight, and not in silence. The meeting began to dissolve, not into disorder, but into action, calls being made, instructions given, the quiet machinery of correction already turning, and Daniel knew his role in this part was done. He turned toward the door, leaving the room without ceremony, without acknowledgement, because what mattered was no longer inside that space. It had already happened elsewhere. The elevator ride down felt different this time. Not longer, not shorter, just clearer, as if each second now belonged to something already resolved. And when the doors opened, he did not hesitate. He walked out into the night again, into the same city, the same streets, but with a different destination, not a boardroom, not an office, but a place far simpler, far quieter. Back at the restaurant, the crowd had thinned, the late evening. Settling into a softer rhythm, Emily Carter wiped the counter, her movements steady, her attention focused on the small details in front of her, the kind of details that most people overlooked, the kind that rarely mattered, until they did. The door opened with a soft chime, and she did not look up immediately, because she did not need to. She had already returned to being unseen, already returned to the rhythm of a night that, for everyone else in that room, had never changed, but for one person walking through that door, everything had. The door closed softly behind him, and for a moment, Daniel Hayes just stood there, not moving, not speaking, simply observing the room from a distance that felt entirely different now. The same tables, the same quiet conversations, the same soft glow of overhead lights reflecting off polished surfaces, and yet none of it felt the same, because he was no longer seeing it as a place to pass through, but as the place where everything had changed. Emily did not look up immediately. She finished placing a glass down, adjusted the edge of a napkin, small details, controlled movements, the rhythm she had always kept, the rhythm that kept her invisible, and when she finally turned, it was not with surprise, not with curiosity, just with quiet acknowledgement, the kind you gave any customer who walked through the door. "Welcome back," she said, her voice calm, even, as if he had never left, as if nothing unusual had happened between then and now. Daniel walked toward the counter, slower this time, not rushed, not driven by urgency, but by something else, something he was not used to, something closer to intention. He stopped just a few feet away, close enough to speak without raising his voice, but far enough to respect the space she stood in, and for a moment, he did not say anything, because the words he had used his entire life, precise, calculated, efficient, did not seem to fit here, not in this moment, not with her. "You wrote that sequence," he said finally, not as a question, but as a recognition. Emily met his gaze briefly, then looked down at the counter again, her hands resting lightly on the surface, steady, composed. "It was just a number," she replied, simple, quiet, as if it had carried no weight at all. Daniel shook his head slightly, not in disagreement, but in understanding. "It was not just a number," he said, his voice softer now, stripped of the authority he carried everywhere else. "It stopped something that would have changed everything." Emily did not respond immediately, not because she did not hear him, but because she chose her words carefully, the same way she chose what to notice, what to act on, and what to leave alone. "You stopped it," she said after a moment, her tone unchanged, matter of fact. "I just pointed at it." The simplicity of her answer settled between them, heavier than any explanation could have been, because it shifted the focus back to where it belonged, not on her, not on recognition, but on responsibility. Daniel let out a quiet breath, something close to a small laugh, but without humor, more like realization. No one else saw it. He said, almost to himself. Emily gave a slight shrug, a small movement, almost unnoticeable. "No one else was listening," she replied, and there it was, the difference, not intelligence, not position, not power, just attention, the willingness to notice something when it would have been easier not to. Daniel nodded slowly, taking that in, not as a lesson spoken, but as one experienced, and for the first time in a long time, he did not feel the need to respond with more words, more explanation, more control. He simply accepted it. He reached into his pocket, not for his phone, not for a card, but for something far more familiar, a sense of acknowledgement that did not require transaction. "Thank you," he said, quietly, and this time, it was enough. Emily looked up again, meeting his gaze just long enough to understand that this was not the kind of gratitude that expected something in return, just recognition, nothing more, nothing less. "You are welcome," she said, just as quietly, and then she picked up a glass, turning slightly as another customer called for service, the moment already passing, already dissolving back into the rhythm of the night. Daniel stood there for a second longer, watching as she moved away, as she returned to being exactly what she had been before, calm, composed, unseen. But now he understood something he had not before, that being unseen did not mean being unimportant, and that sometimes, the person who changes everything is the one no one ever thought to notice. He turned and walked toward the door again, the city waiting outside, the same as always, but not the same to him, not anymore. Because somewhere between a quiet sentence and a handwritten number, something had shifted, not just in a boardroom, but in the way he would see the world from that night forward.